Tell me, where do you usually watch my videos? At home, work, or somewhere else?
My brother Eli was born on a Sunday morning in July, and from the moment he let out his first cry, my father called him the future. That was the first story I ever heard in our house. My mother repeated it like a hymn. How Eli had thick hair even as a newborn, how he gripped the doctor's finger like he already knew what he wanted. I came 3 years later, in the dead of winter, on a night when the power had gone out and the pipes were frozen. Nobody called me the future. In fact, if they called me anything at all, it was usually quiet or strange or a little too much like your mother, which in my family was never a compliment. We grew up in a brick ranch-style house on the edge of Nashville, the kind of place where the front lawn stayed manicured year-round and the neighbors knew the names of your dogs but not your kids. My father built that house with money he scraped together from buying and flipping run-down homes in the early 80s. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, he was already something of a local real estate legend, every bit as proud of his empire as he was of Eli. Maybe more. The more properties signs went up all over town, and when people saw him in the diner or the hardware store, they nodded with that peculiar kind of respect, reserved for self-made men who know how to make a buck and don't mind telling you how they did it. Eli followed him like a shadow. From the time he was 10, he was helping our dad measure walls and talk to contractors, carrying his clipboard and mimicking his cadence. He had this way of charming people that made grown men laugh and old ladies squeeze his cheeks, even when he was nearly grown. By the time he turned 18, he had his own business cards. Mine were hand-me-downs from Office Depot, blank on one side, perfect for scribbling poetry I'd never show anyone. Mom left when I was 12. It happened so quietly, I still can't recall whether I heard the front door shut or just felt it. She left a note, but Dad burned it in the sink before I could read it. He told Eli she was weak. He told me she was selfish. And then he told both of us we didn't need her, that we'd be better off without someone who didn't know how to finish what she started. I never saw her again. I think Eli didn't want to. I think I did, but that wasn't a popular opinion in our house. From that point on, Dad ran things like a military operation. There were rules, no second chances, no crying, and absolutely no talking back. I learned how to fix a leaky pipe before I was 13. I learned how to swallow anger without letting it touch my eyes. Eli got the praise when he came home with trophies and medals. I got silence when I came home with straight A's. Once, when I won a writing contest at school, I left the ribbon on the kitchen table. It disappeared by morning. I never saw it again, but that's not to say I didn't learn from him. I did. Maybe not the same lessons Eli did. How to sweet-talk a buyer, how to spin a story just enough to get the signature on the dotted line. But I learned patience. I learned to observe, to listen when no one knew I was listening. And most of all, I learned that power didn't always look like a handshake or a smile. Sometimes, it was just knowing when to speak. When we were in our 20s, Eli stayed. He slid right into the family business like he'd been born wearing a branded polo shirt. He married a woman who smiled like she practiced in the mirror and had 2 kids that he paraded through Christmas cards like catalog models. I left. I moved to Denver, found a job at a nonprofit, married a man with calloused hands and tired eyes. We didn't have kids. We had silence. It suited me just fine. Then about a year ago, I got the call. Eli's voice was clipped and controlled, like he was reading off a clipboard. "Dad's sick," he said. "Real sick. You should come home." He didn't say our dad, just Dad, like he still owned the patent on the man. So I went home. The house looked the same, but smaller somehow. The bricks darker, the yard messier, like time had shrunk it. I walked in and smelled lemon cleaner and old leather, the scent of my childhood. Dad was in a hospital bed in the living room, too proud to be shipped off to a facility, too weak to leave the recliner. His face was sunken, and the bravado that had once filled every inch of him was leaking out slowly like air from a tire. When I walked in, he looked at me for a long time, like he was trying to decide which version of me to see, the child who always came second or the woman who'd vanished. Eli stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes wary. He didn't offer a hug. I didn't ask for one. The first night, I didn't say much. I sat in the corner, watched Eli spoon-feed our father broth, and talk about business deals like he was reporting from the front lines. I just listened. I noticed how Dad barely responded, how his eyes kept drifting toward me, even when Eli was mid-sentence. On the third day, when Eli had gone out to take a call, Dad asked me to sit with him. His voice was thin, but it still had that edge, like a blade dulled but not broken. "I made a lot of mistakes," he said, eyes not meeting mine. "But I know who the fighter is." I didn't respond, not right away. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "Close the door, Lena." And just like that, I knew. Whatever he was about to say wasn't meant for anyone else. Not Eli, not the lawyers, not even the nurses who shuffled in with morphine and wet cloths. He was going to give me something. Maybe not forgiveness, maybe not love, but something he'd kept hidden, just like everything else in that house. And I was ready to take it. The morning of the reading, the sky looked the same way it had the day we buried him, gray with a kind of humid thickness that made your skin feel heavy, like the air itself didn't want to move forward. The lawyer's office sat in a squat brick building across from an abandoned feed store, and I parked under a leaning oak tree that looked like it might give up and fall on my rental car out of spite. I was early, but Eli was already inside, of course. He always liked being first in the room, not because he was eager, but because he wanted the power that came from being the one people had to greet. When I walked in, he didn't stand. He just gave me that polite, meaningless smile people give when they want to pretend everything is fine, when it very obviously isn't. The same smile he wore at the funeral when he wrapped one arm around me, like we were some united front. Just a pair of grieving siblings saying goodbye to their father. I let him have the illusion then, because illusions are all some people have, and because I hadn't yet decided when or how to break it. The lawyer, Robert Lewis, looked like every other man who'd ever written up a will in the state of Tennessee, white hair, slightly stooped, dressed like he thought khakis counted as formal wear, and speaking in a tone that suggested he hadn't experienced surprise since the Nixon administration. He shook both our hands, offered coffee neither of us accepted, and then cleared his throat with the kind of weight that suggested something momentous was about to happen. But even as he opened the file in front of him, I already knew what was written on the page. I had seen it before, years ago when I first moved away, and Dad made it clear where things stood. The original will was old, typed on yellowing paper and bearing a signature that looked as though it had been scratched into the page. By a man who didn't believe in subtlety. Robert began reading, his voice low and even, devoid of emotion. It was short, barely a paragraph. "To my son Eli Moore, I leave full and sole ownership of all Moore Properties holdings, assets, and financial accounts. To my daughter, Lena Moore, I leave my personal effects and any items she wishes to keep from the family home. This is my final will and testament." He folded the document, placed it gently on the table between us, and looked up. The silence in the room was absolute. Eli exhaled through his nose and leaned back like he was relieved, like the world had finally done what it was supposed to, and reaffirmed that he was, indeed, the chosen one. His voice, when he spoke, was casual and smooth, but there was something smug sitting just beneath the surface. "Well," he said, tapping the table with one perfectly manicured finger, "that settles that." I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just reached into my bag, pulled out a single document, and slid it across the table with the same care you might use if you were placing a loaded weapon down between two people who didn't quite trust each other. Robert glanced at it. Then he looked back at me. "I think," I said, my voice calm, almost curious, "you'll find that this supersedes what you just read." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the lawyer picked up the paper and began to read. I watched his eyes track the words, watched the furrow form in his brow. When he reached the signature line, he paused, squinted slightly, and then looked at the date. his lips pressed into a line so tight it could have sliced glass. "This is dated 3 weeks before your father passed," he said slowly, as if speaking the fact aloud might make it less real. "It appears to be a full transfer of ownership, including all real estate, investments, and operating accounts, into your name, signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk." Eli sat forward so fast his chair squeaked across the floor. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, loud, jagged at the edges. "That's not the will. The will is what you just read. This can't be real." But Robert wasn't looking at him. He was still reading the document, flipping it over, inspecting the notary seal. I had made sure every piece of it was in place, every line legal, every date double-checked. It was as real as Eli's entitlement and twice as powerful. "It's real," I said softly, "and it's binding." Eli turned to me then, and I saw something new in his face. Not just anger, but confusion. Not the kind that comes from being surprised, but the kind that comes from a man who just realized the script he's been living his whole life might have been rewritten without his permission. "This isn't what he wanted," he hissed. His hands balled into fists. "You think you can just show up and take everything? After all these years? After being gone? After leaving me to run the business? Take care of him?" I leaned back in my chair and looked him dead in the eye. "You weren't taking care of him. You were waiting for him to die." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And in that silence, I felt something shift. Not triumph exactly, and not satisfaction either. Just clarity, cold, clean clarity. This wasn't about what Dad wanted. It wasn't even about what was fair. This was about what was done, what was signed, and what couldn't be undone. That's the thing people don't understand about revenge. It doesn't shout. It doesn't kick down the door and scream. Sometimes it just sits in a quiet room, lays a piece of paper on the table, and waits. And that morning, in that office, with the will still warm from the lawyer's hands, I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. There's a kind of silence that happens in a hospital room when a man knows he's dying. It isn't just quiet in the traditional sense. No beeping machines or rustling gowns or low voices from nurses in the hallway. It's heavier than that. Like the air has thickened around his bed and pressed down on every word before it even forms. That's what I walked into the day my father asked me to close the door. It was late afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the blinds in a way that reminded me of the summers we spent sweating through repair jobs on rental properties. The dust and sawdust clinging to his clothes like part of the fabric. He looked small now, shrunken in a body that had once filled a room by force of will alone, his hands trembling slightly as they lay on top of the blanket, the blue of his veins stark against the paper-thin skin. His eyes, so often hard, calculating, judgmental, were different that day. Not soft exactly, but still watchful. As if he was finally seeing something without needing to speak over it. I pulled the door shut behind me, letting the latch click into place with the finality of a lock, and crossed the room to sit beside him. For a few moments we didn't speak. I didn't rush it, and neither did he. He knew time was short, but he also knew that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. He'd made a career out of choosing the right moment to say just enough, and he wasn't about to break that habit now. "You remember the house on Ellington Drive?" he asked finally, his voice dry and low, like it had to be scraped up from somewhere deep. I nodded, unsure what to say. That house had been the first one he ever bought outright. A sagging bungalow with a caved-in porch and a patchy backyard. He'd pulled it out of ruin with his own 2 hands, and I'd helped him paint the shutters one summer when I was barely old enough to hold the brush. "I sold it for almost 6 times what I paid," he said, a small, bitter chuckle catching in his throat. "Back then, everybody said I was crazy. Told me I was throwing money into a sinkhole." I waited. I knew this wasn't a story about real estate. "I built all this," he continued, waving one thin hand in the air, as if to gesture at a kingdom only he could still see. "But I built it for the wrong reasons. I thought money would buy me control, respect, maybe even love, if I waved it around hard enough. You know what it got me instead? A son who sees everything as an inheritance, and a daughter who disappeared to Colorado because she couldn't stand the sight of me. His words landed like stones in a pond, rippling outward. I didn't argue, though the temptation to correct him, to remind him that I hadn't vanished so much as been pushed away, was strong. But that wasn't why I was there. This wasn't about blame anymore. I should have told you years ago, he said, closing his eyes briefly. Should have said a lot of things, but I always thought I had more time. Always thought you come back angry, yelling like your mother, but you didn't. You stayed quiet. You waited. He opened his eyes again, and for the first time in my life, I saw regret there. Not the performative kind that gets trotted out during speeches or holidays, but the real thing, raw, unvarnished. He reached over to the nightstand and picked up a folder I hadn't noticed before, thick with papers, rubber banded shut. He handed it to me, and I took it carefully, feeling the weight of something more than just paper. I had it drawn up last week, he said. It's a full transfer, properties, accounts, everything. Not just because you're my daughter, because you're the only one I trust to know what any of it is really worth. And I'm not talking dollars. I didn't say anything right away. My hands gripped the folder, my thumb running across the edge of the paper. He watched me for a long moment, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Don't show it to him, not yet. Let him believe he's already won. That's how you beat someone like Eli. You let him walk into the room thinking the crown is already on his head." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood. My father hadn't changed completely. He was still a strategist, still a man who believed in leverage, in control, in timing. This was just his final play, and I was the one he'd handed the chessboard to. It wasn't love, it wasn't even redemption, but it was something. It was the first time he'd looked at me and seen more than a shadow of my mother, or a disappointment hiding behind a college degree he never approved of. He saw someone capable, dangerous, necessary. When I left that day, I didn't cry. I didn't look back at his sleeping figure in the bed or listen for the sound of his breathing. I just slipped the folder into my bag and walked out the front door into the early evening light, the weight of a different future pressing down on my shoulders like a second spine. I didn't tell Eli. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't even tell my best friend back in Denver, though she noticed something was different when I got home, something in the way I moved or didn't speak unless I had to. For weeks, I let the world turn on its usual axis. I watched as Eli took over meetings, sent emails with Dad's signature block still at the bottom, started consolidating properties like he already wore the crown. He didn't ask for my input. He didn't even check in. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, though, was how easy it was not to care, not to feel wounded by his assumption that I was irrelevant. Maybe that was the strangest gift my father ever gave me. Not the money, not the power, but the realization that I didn't need to be acknowledged to be dangerous, that the real strength was in patience, in silence, in knowing what you held and waiting for the right moment to show your hand. So when the lawyer read the will and Eli leaned back with that practiced smirk, so sure that the story was over and that he'd walked off with the happy ending, I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or protest or argue. Instead, I reached into my bag and laid down the one document that mattered. And in that moment, everything changed. When the meeting ended and I walked out of Robert's office with the document under my arm, and Eli's stunned silence echoing behind me like a threat still deciding whether it wanted to roar or hiss, I didn't feel triumphant the way some people might imagine. There was no surge of adrenaline, no victorious soundtrack rising in my chest. What I felt was something colder, something more calculated, like I'd just moved a heavy piece across a chessboard and now had to wait, patient and unblinking, for the rest of the pieces to shift. Revenge doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like waiting for a storm to finally arrive after you've watched the clouds pile up for years. Eli called me less than 2 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. The first message was curt, controlled, full of legal-sounding words he didn't fully understand. We need to talk. I think you may have misinterpreted something. We should discuss this before we escalate. The second one, 3 hours later, had the beginning edges of panic curling around his voice. This isn't going to end well for you. I've already spoken to someone. I don't think that document's enforceable. By the next morning, the mask had fallen entirely, and the third message was nothing but venom. Each syllable spit out like he wanted to see it bruise. You think this makes you smart? You think this makes you strong? All it proves is that you're a snake. You were never part of this family, and now you've proved it. I didn't respond. I forwarded all the messages to my lawyer, a woman named Marissa I'd met during a zoning dispute years ago, who had the personality of a stone wall and the mind of a scalpel. She called me after listening to them, her tone unreadable as always. He's flailing, she said, which means you've got him exactly where you want him. But make no mistake, this is going to get ugly. I told her I wasn't afraid of ugly. I'd grown up with it sitting at the dinner table, tucked between the roast beef and the silence, taking bites out of my confidence every time someone told me to just let Eli handle it. The first battle came fast. Eli tried to file an injunction in county court to freeze all transfers, citing mental incompetence, coercion, and undue influence. It was the kind of last-minute Hail Mary play you throw when you don't have the ball but want the audience to think you're still in the game. Marissa dismantled it like it was a bad script written by a nervous intern. We had the notary's testimony. We had the video from the hospital room, a requirement the lawyer had insisted on since my father's condition was known, and contested by no one. We had the time-stamped filings. But more than any of that, we had the thing Eli would never be able to manufacture. My father's voice on that tape, clear and slow and deliberate, saying that he trusted me, that he wanted me to have everything, and that Eli's never understood that legacy isn't about appearances, it's about decisions. That recording played in the courtroom like a final confession, the last nail in the version of the family Eli had built around himself like armor. He watched it with his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists in his lap, and though he didn't say a word during the hearing, I could see it in his eyes. That bitter, stinging realization that he'd underestimated me the same way Dad always had. And now it had cost him everything. The court ruled in my favor, and the transfer was finalized. The title documents were reissued in my name. The bank accounts updated. The property shifted. But that was only the legal victory. The real war was just beginning. I expected Eli to retreat. Maybe lick his wounds in silence and start building a new empire out of spite. But he didn't. Instead, he went scorched earth. He started telling people I had forged the document. He whispered to our distant relatives that I'd blackmailed Dad on his deathbed. He called my husband and told him I'd been planning this for years and had probably married him as part of the scheme. He even managed to get one of the local newspapers to run a thinly veiled editorial about sibling betrayal and suspicious signatures in Southern real estate dynasties. But what Eli didn't understand, and what he never would, not really, was that I didn't need people to like me. I didn't need their sympathy, their approval, or their shocked faces at Sunday brunch. I wasn't in this to win a popularity contest. I was in it to set the record straight, to take what was mine, to rewrite a story that had been handed to me half-finished, with all the best pages torn out. So I did something he never saw coming. I took the oldest property, the one on Ellington Drive, where he and I had painted shutters and scraped linoleum in the summer heat until our fingers bled, and I donated it to a local housing nonprofit in our mother's name. The news picked it up within the week. Pictures of the modest house, cleaned up and repainted, filled with volunteers and local politicians shaking hands, ran in the community section of the paper Eli had tried to weaponize. I didn't give an interview. I didn't pose for the camera. I just let the gesture speak for itself, and speak it did. Eli called again after that. He didn't leave a message this time. I watched the screen light up with his name, then go dark, then light up again, and for a moment I wondered if he was sitting in his car somewhere, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white. trying to figure out whether to scream or cry. I didn't pick up. I didn't need to hear whatever words he'd finally choke out. Because this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a fight anymore. It was cleanup. And Eli? He was just the wreckage left behind when a man builds his legacy out of assumption and ego, and then finds out too late that someone else was watching the whole time, taking notes, waiting for the right moment to take the pen and start rewriting. I had waited long enough, and I wasn't done. The finality of a courtroom decision, even one in your favor, is a strange and hollow kind of victory, not unlike being handed the deed to a house after watching it burn halfway to the ground, with the ashes still warm and the smell of smoke soaked deep into your skin. In the weeks that followed the ruling, while the accounts were transferred and the ownership records updated, and the keys to every building, office, and forgotten storage shed found their way into my hands, I began to understand that the thing I had always thought I wanted, the recognition, the power, the validation of being chosen, was something else entirely when you were holding it alone. Eli had gone silent, and for once, his silence wasn't strategic. There were no more phone calls, no more whispered accusations to local press, or vague threats buried in family dinners. He vanished into the background, slipping away from the spotlight he had once treated as his birthright. And I knew instinctively that he wasn't giving up so much as waiting for me to feel the weight of what I'd taken. The Moore family estate sat on 10 acres of rolling land just outside the city, bordered by a rusted fence that had once been painted white and was now peeling like old skin. It had been my father's pride, not because of its size or its beauty. It had neither of those in abundance, but because it was the first place he had bought that felt permanent. It was where he had installed the heavy oak desk in the study, the same one Eli used now to manage the books until the day he was locked out of the system entirely. It was where my mother had planted roses along the side of the porch, before she left them to wither like everything else she had touched in this family. And it was the place I returned to one final time, not out of nostalgia or some poetic need for closure, but because I wanted to see for myself what he had truly left behind. I moved through the house slowly, the soles of my shoes echoing against hardwood that had warped in places from years of neglect and southern humidity. Every room had the stale scent of dust and old ambition, like the very walls remembered the deals struck within them and were ashamed. His study remained untouched, papers still stacked in neat columns, pens aligned perfectly along the blotter as though he might return at any moment to continue signing his name on things with the same authority he always believed was eternal. But the room that stopped me cold wasn't the office or the bedroom or even the attic filled with relics from a childhood I barely remembered. It was the narrow storage closet beneath the stairs, the one he had kept locked for as long as I could remember, with a key he always claimed had been lost during a move. I found the key tucked in the back of the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped in an old handkerchief with a monogram I didn't recognize. When I slid it into the lock and turned it, the click echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house, and for a moment I stood there, hands still on the knob, wondering whether I truly wanted to know what he had hidden all these years. But curiosity is a funny thing. It doesn't just knock, it waits. And once the door was open, there was no pretending I hadn't seen what lay inside. The box was ordinary in appearance, cardboard, worn at the corners, the kind you could buy in bulk at an office supply store, but its contents were anything but. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with time and tied together with a red ribbon that had frayed at the ends. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakable. It was my mother's. They were all addressed to him, some marked "Return to Sender," others unopened entirely, but each one bore dates that spanned nearly a decade after she had left. I sat on the floor of that cramped closet and began to read, one by one, her voice rising from the pages with a clarity that made the years collapse around me like wet paper. She hadn't abandoned us, not in the way we'd been told. She had tried to come back. Repeatedly, she had written to him, begged him to let her see us, offered to come back under any condition, just to be allowed to be part of our lives again. She spoke of the mistakes she had made, of the silence that had stretched between her and my father like barbed wire, and how it was never her intention to leave for good. She wrote about me, about the guilt that followed her for never having the chance to explain, for wondering whether I believed she had stopped loving me, or worse, had never loved me to begin with. She had sent Christmas cards, drawings, photographs of herself standing in front of unfamiliar houses with unfamiliar people, always smiling with a kind of practiced bravery I recognized all too well. My father had never shown us these letters. He had never told us she reached out. He let us believe the simpler version of the truth, the one where she vanished, and he, despite his flaws, had remained. And in doing so, he had shaped us into versions of ourselves molded by resentment and abandonment, rather than truth and forgiveness. I realized then that the inheritance he had left me was never really the buildings or the accounts or the title of owner. It was this, the truth, hidden and rotting in a box beneath the stairs, like a wound no one had ever bothered to clean. I took the letters with me and locked the house behind me for the final time. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the tall grass around the property and sending a flock of birds skyward from the edge of the woods. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like closure either. It felt like the kind of ending that didn't resolve but simply paused, waiting for someone else to decide what came next. I didn't know if I would reach out to her. I didn't know if she was even alive. But I knew for the first time that the story I'd been told was incomplete, and that the power to finish it, however messily, however painfully, was mine. As I drove away from the estate, the road ahead seemed unfamiliar, though I had driven it countless times before. Maybe that's what happens when you finally stop looking backward and begin to wonder, not about what you've won or lost, but about who you've become in the process of fighting for something you were never supposed to want. I had everything now. Every key, every deed, every record. But I couldn't help asking myself, with the letters folded on the seat beside me, and Eli's silence stretching out like a void behind me, was it justice? Or was it just the cleanest revenge money could buy?